nutrition cannot of itself succeed. And that's why we wanted to put this together. You've had 2 days where we've been talking about the specifics around nutrition, and now we want to end up by sending you away with the deep understanding, as I'm sure you already have it, but with some more detail around the issues of the environmental, the intergenerational, and related barriers to achieving a really positive growth and development of a young baby, infant, child in the developing world setting. So with that brief introduction to what the intention of this whole session is, let me move on to my own presentation. I'd like to start with my disclosures, which you see up there, but also take the opportunity now to thank my funders rather than doing it at the end. The UK Medical Research Council has made incredible contributions with long-term sustained funding of the work of the unit in the Gambia for more than 70 years now. And that, I think, has paid great dividends to have that long-term security of funding. I've also received significant funding from the Wellcome Trust and from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation as the primary funders, and I thank them all. So, I've already said a few moments ago that poor diets are, of course, a major part of the problem. And that's what we've been talking about so far. Those poor diets are often articulated in the phrase low dietary diversity. And in many ways, that again says it all, whether we're talking about protein quality, as Mark Manari did, or whatever. It comes down, at the end of the day, to poor diets, and particularly with poor dietary diversity, all of which is driven either by the environments that those people live in, where it is difficult to acquire foods, or the fact that even if such foods were available, those people could not afford those foods. So let's start off with that. And again, I would like to make the point, as others have done before me, that breastfeeding is central to this. The population that I work in is a fantastic, there must be some of the world record breastfeeders. Everybody breastfeeds. They breastfeed wonderfully in a very relaxed and open way. No one would dream of not breastfeeding. And the median time of exclusive breastfeeding is just over 5 months, and they tend to feed for 2 years. However, in spite of that, which we would assume to be the Rolls-Royce, the gold standard start, these children still do not do well in terms of their growth and development. So what I'm going to tell you about today are get you to think a little bit about the possible influence of subclinical viral, bacterial, and protozoal infections, and I'll challenge you in a second. I'm going to talk about toxins in the environment, particularly aflatoxins. I'm going to talk about this issue of environmental enteric disease, so-called EED, which I think many of you will be familiar with. And then I'm going to end up with some new data relating to persistent low-grade inflammation, which we believe to be a very important player, especially in relation to some of the micronutrient deficiencies. But let's start by reminding ourselves that stunting, of course, predicts immediate and lifelong disadvantages. And Lynette told us about that in the introductory talk. We all know that, but I just wanted to re-emphasize that it's not just stunting. When a child grows poorly, their head grows poorly. So here's the change in the proportion of children whose head circumference is below -2 standard deviations of the World Health norms in the Gambia. And you can see that we start off with about 5% below that cutoff. And by the time they're a year or so older, that has tripled in boys and doubled in girls. And clearly this is not good news. Head circumference is tightly correlated with brain volume, which studies have shown to be, give or take, correlated with cognition and IQ. And so, of course, a deficit like that is potentially going to have a huge effect on learning and on what we call the development of human capital of our nations. Now, you're all familiar with this. This is an aggregated data from 54 low and middle income countries, and the blue line there shows that on average, across all of these countries, children do very poorly compared to the horizontal line there, which represents the median for growth in the WHO centiles. So the children do badly. Let's focus on what happens in the Gambia. Slightly different scale, but this really concentrates the mind. These children are born not too bad. They are about 300 or 400 grams smaller than we would expect in the UK. So mean birth weight is much higher than in this region of India or in Bangladesh next door, about 2,950 grams. So they're not too bad at birth, but look at this precipitate drop-off. And then note that at about 2 years of age, there tends to be a spontaneous recovery. So what does this tell us? Are we feeding the children so much worse during this period? Or is something else driving it? And I think the obvious conclusion has to be that something else is driving this, particularly when I re-emphasize that the breastfeeding rates in this country are exceptionally good. So here's a random picture of a small boy. And if you can see it well enough, you'll see that he is chewing on an old corn cob that has been lying down in the dirt and in the cattle, sheep, and chicken feces. I don't know where his mother is, but she should be somewhere nearer and taking it out of his mouth, or some other child or an aunt or someone should be stopping this behavior. And Jean Humphrey later will talk more about this. But look also at that child. He's got a runny nose. He's got skin infections, probably a fungal infection all over his head. But he's not wasted. He's actually quite a chunky, chubby kid. I haven't actually measured this one. I don't know what his head circumference is or his height, but on average in this population, he would be short, despite of not being grossly malnourished. So let's start off with the first of my list. The issue around subclinical viral, bacterial, and protozoal infections. I don't think we think about this enough. Here's my colleague, Helen Nabuera, doing a clinic in Kenabar. Lovely, healthy-looking kid. Pediatricians amongst the audience, who amongst you have diagnosed your children with any one of these? This is, of course, a little bit of a quiz. The answers are as follows. But I would challenge you, and I would say that none of you have ever diagnosed a child with a fever as being in the acute phase of, for instance, a hepatitis B or a hepatitis A infection. None of you would have recognized the moment at which these babies are infected with CMV or with EB. Yet in our population, children are almost universally antibody positive to those viruses by the time they're 1 year of age. Not hepatitis B now, because they all get vaccinated. So these children are seeing these viruses. They're mounting a response to them, but we never see them as a clinical syndrome. H. pylori similarly, Campylobacter, which I think Jean will talk about more, Giardia lamblia. So straight away, we see that these kids are having to battle these ever-present infections, and yet we as clinicians or as scientists never see this happening. Here's just the example of giardiasis. So you know the life cycle, and the metrics from the Gambia are that in our rural infants, the median age of first exposure is 3 to 4 months. And by 8 months, 95% of children are either actively infected or are showing signs that they have been infected in the past. So I think that's a big issue that we haven't really thought about sufficiently. What about aflatoxins? I don't know what the situation is in India, but I'm sure there's plenty of aflatoxin in the environment here. You're all familiar with the story that aflatoxin is produced, the various different aflatoxins are produced by Aspergillus fungus. These are rather heavily infected peanuts at the top and maize at the bottom. But even if you have a much lower infestation with fungal spores or growth, you will still have aflatoxin present. Here's some data from Gambian children. We measure the aflatoxin as the adult level because it binds to albumin. So that's how we measure it. And look at the exposure here. At birth and in young childhood, there's not a great deal of exposure. Incidentally, the placenta protects the growing baby, and aflatoxin is not passed over in a large amount into the breast milk because the mother's liver deals with it. But by the time they're getting their own personal exposure, you can see that there are very high levels of exposure by the time the children are 12 months or 18 months. I don't have time to go into the details of this, but we and others have published papers showing that there is certainly a discernible relationship between aflatoxin adult levels and growth, and that it might possibly be mediated through some of the hepatotoxic effects and through epigenetic changes in IGF-1 in the liver. This, I guess, is the big one, and Jean, I'm sure, will be talking about this in her talk. So I'm just going to give you a quick reminder rather than going through in too much detail. Jean wrote a seminal article in The Lancet some years ago, probably over a decade ago, which brought this to the fore, an issue that, indeed, my predecessors in my research institute in Gambia had been very much instrumental in demonstrating, and other people in Guatemala and other countries. The issue, of course, and again, as you know very well, is that there is a vicious cycle between malnutrition and disease. So we can start anywhere on this cycle, but a poor diet would weaken the child and its gastric barriers. It'll have diarrhea and infections, which will cause further consolidated damage to the intestine. That, in turn, will cause a whole load of syndromic effects, primarily around malabsorption. That will drive loss of appetite. The inflammation will drive loss of appetite, which furthers the problems of poor diet, and we go round in the circle again. Here's generally what happens. You can have the pathogenesis of the gut dysfunction. It's mooted as to whether there are different effects in different environments, but certainly pathogenic assault is part of it, the diarrhea that results from those pathogens, but allergens might well be an important part, even in a setting like this. And gut dysbiosis, which we'll be hearing about from Rory Robertson a little later this morning. And all of these are part and parcel of being chronically exposed to a very poor and dirty environment. Let's look at the final endpoint of this in a bit more detail. So those lovely healthy villi shown in the background end up being stunted. So the absorptive capacity of the villi is greatly reduced. There's a so-called crypt hyperplasia. The crypts are enlarged. There's the leaky membrane, the loss of tight junctions at the barrier. And that is part and parcel of making a child more prone to the bacterial translocation that Mark Mannery told us about yesterday. And not only the translocation of entire bacteria, but the translocation of bacterial debris, particularly LPS, which may drive up low-grade or even high-grade inflammation, which has its own effect on the growth IGF axis. And then underlying the barrier itself, there's a fulminant, non-resolving inflammation, which is clearly taking up nutrients and energy from the main processes that the child is trying to enact and trying to grow. It's not really surprising that these children suffer this. They're living in a poor environment. You see in the background the pigeon, the chicken that may have just walked through that bowl, the puppy nearby, the sheep, and so forth. And again, Jean will be talking about this in terms of how we try to combat these effects. Here are just some more images of these kids living their normal everyday life in this environment. So, persistent environmental enteropathy is a big issue. The reason I've glossed over it relatively quickly now is, as I've said a moment ago, because Jean will be saying more about it. Let's take the last of these before I'll then sum up with a few words about what we can try and do about all of this. So, this issue of persistent low-grade inflammation. Now, in the West, we're used to thinking about this as part and parcel, perhaps, of the etiology of heart disease, the relationship between inflammation, even driven by poor oral hygiene, drives up inflammation. Certain studies have shown that if you measure indices of inflammation at baseline and then look at the 5-10-year follow-up in terms of cases of incident heart disease or diabetes, you can relate that to measures of inflammation at baseline. So we know that inflammation is very important, and this low-grade inflammation is important in terms of driving disease processes. But we perhaps haven't thought about it very greatly in a developing world setting. So I want to share with you some data that have, in fact, been published very recently. And it's in relation to iron deficiency. So iron deficiency anemia affects an estimated, these are data from the latest Global Burden of Disease 2017, it affects an estimated 1.25 billion. It doesn't really matter how accurate that number is, it's a very big number. And in those countries where you see a beige color there, those are the countries in which iron deficiency anemia is the primary contributor to lives lived with disability. And by that metric of lives used with disability, although it's been said before in this symposium that iron deficiency generally doesn't kill you, it does have estimated harmful effects on disability life years. And by that metric, iron deficiency anemia is by far the most common micronutrient deficiency and has a greater effect than all the other micronutrients put together, plus the hemolytic anemias and the hemoglobinopathies. Now, let's look at what happens in a rural area such as the Gambia. So the lines there are African-American data. You'll see the 50th centile at the top, traditionally pink for girls, blue for boys. The lower line is the 5th centile of the African-American data. And the bars are data from our biobank from some 4,500 children measured here. Again, pink for girls, blue for boys. There's not much difference between the sexes. The numbers in squares are the percent anemic. So you'll see in very young infancy, our mean hemoglobin is below 10. That's the mean, is well below 10. And 91% of the children are anemic. That's a serious situation. I'll just have you look again to remind us that it's this first 2 years of life that is really critical. Look at the gap in the first 2 years of life compared to the later years. So the tends, as I showed you for the weight and height, to be a bit of a recovery in later childhood. And again, I think this is driven by the fact that children are seeing so many infections in early life and then are managing to build up their resistance to those. Now, the question is, and Santrain Pashrisha talked about this, if we were able to give these children iron in the most rigorous of controlled conditions, how much effect would we have? And that meta-analysis has been done by the World Health Organization, and here's the answer. We would have actually a very disappointing effect. So we would increase the hemoglobin by about 1/2 of 1 gram, and we would reduce the prevalence rate in the 1-year-olds from 91 down to 67%, but still 67% would be anemic. And Santa described some of the reasons, including the fact that not all of this anemia is due to iron deficiency, of course. But that's a very disappointing result. So let's address the question, why? And I mentioned to you that this paper has just appeared, in fact, 3 days ago in Science Advances. And as you can see from the title, it talks about respiratory infections. I want to just very quickly tell you that story. So we, in our group and collaborating with Santrain and others, have been very focused on the iron regulatory hormone hepcidin. And we strongly believe that this gives us new insights into what is going on. It's been incredibly helpful in terms of understanding the pathogenesis of iron deficiency and iron deficiency anemia. I think most of you will be familiar, at least to some extent, with hepcidin. Hepcidin is regulated not only by iron status, so in cases of iron overload, hepcidin would increase and would stop iron being absorbed. In cases of iron deficiency, hepcidin would be reduced and would promote the absorption and redistribution of iron. But it's also driven by inflammation. And this is what's so fascinating about this molecule that integrates signals from iron status and from inflammation. And when inflammation is present, primarily through IL-6, it drives up hepcidin, and this blocks both the intestinal absorption of iron and the redistribution of iron through macrophages. Now, what we did is we took 407 children who were participating in a randomized trial, the details of which are not important at the moment. And as part of this trial, we took a finger prick sample every week for 13 weeks, and we measured their hepcidin. So each little vertical line there is an individual child, and as you see, there are 407 of those. The line represents their mean hepcidin plus the standard error of their individual mean, and they're all put in rank order. When I first plotted this, I was blown away. Wow, some children here are never producing any hepcidin. It's completely downregulated. Other children are producing vast amounts, and at the top right-hand end of that, that is a very large amount of hepcidin for children to be producing. You'll be asking yourselves, what's the difference between green and red? So in prior work, we had established a threshold, indeed with the great help of Santrain, wherever he is, there he is, to define whether children would be likely to be absorbing iron or blocking the absorption of iron. And the threshold of 5.5 nanograms per liter that we established is indicated by that red line. So what you see there is that half of these children, for most of the 13 weeks of this study, are intentionally blocking iron absorption. They are not, as we used to consider, poorly evolved children whose duodenum is very poor at absorbing iron. They are actively working to keep the iron out of the system. And we would intuit that this is an evolutionary adaptation to protect them from infection. Now, what is driving that? So in multiple regression analysis, we showed very clearly that it was driven partly by iron status and partly by inflammation, very greatly by inflammation. So if we statistically correct away the inflammation from this, then all the children now are summarized in a single dot. But what we will now see is that if we weren't inflamed, then every single one of those children would be below that threshold and would be absorbing iron better when the inflammation was gone. So we then asked the question, well, what is the source of that inflammation? And to cut a relatively complicated story short, as I've already indicated in the title of that paper, we found that the answer was that it seemed to be respiratory infections, which was a great surprise to us when we shared this information with the Gates Foundation and said, what do you think is the source of the inflammation? One of the very senior program officers there said to me, it's obvious, the gut, and the gut. But in fact, we get no signal from diarrhea. We get no signal from fecal calprotectin, which is an index of gut dysfunction. We get a very strong signal from fevers, and we get a very strong signal from respiratory infections. So I think this, to me, represents a very new insight. It may well be that a child, even a child as in this picture, just with a common cold and a snotty nose, it may well be that inflammation of the airways and the respiratory tract may be an important driver of iron deficiency and its consequent anemia. So that would be a very important new finding, and one which would readdress our minds in terms of what we need to do about the problem. And here we go with a pediatrician again, listening to a child's chest, but never in a million years would she have said, that child is likely to be anemic because of the wheeze or the pneumonia that I find in that child. She would far more likely to be looking for hookworms or malaria or other infestations as a cause of her anemia. So there we go. We've gone through those four, and I want to wrap up now with going back to this issue and thinking a few thoughts about what we can do about it. The first thing I want to do is to summarize the meta-analyzed effects of food interventions. So again, we saw a bit of this on Monday. That red arrow there is the meta-analyzed effect of randomized controlled trials done under very rigorous conditions of feeding interventions, complementary feeding interventions. Now what you see, it's not nothing, but it's really extremely disappointing. This is the best we can do, even in these strictly controlled trials. So what's going on here? Why can't we do better than that? And of course we come back to this issue of the poor hygiene and WASH, and you're going to be hearing details around that from Jean. So Jean, I promise I'm not going to steal all your thunder, but Jean will tell you about these trials. I think you already know that the result of those trials has been very disappointing, and that is one bit of your thunder that I will steal, Jean, because I think most people will have seen your papers already. So the question is, should we despair? If we have so far found it difficult to turn the needle through WASH interventions. Is intervention futile? And I think we would all agree that no, of course we mustn't despair, and there are things we can think about into the future. And I show this graph as something which I think is, gives us great hope. So this is the fact that stunting resolves extremely rapidly as nations pass through the economic transition and become wealthier. And of course, your country here is one of those that is rapidly passing through this transition, of course with great dispersion and diversity within the nation, but ultimately you're making great progress. If I showed you a similar one for anemia, the story would be similar, that anemia pretty much disappears spontaneously. So that's the good news. The difficult thing, though, is what do we do in the meantime and in those countries that aren't fortunate enough to work their way through that transition? So I just want to show you a little bit of data that we published recently, which suggests that there's a very high threshold of economic development and hygiene and housing that has to be reached. So we realized that in this research center that I work at in rural Gambia, we had a natural experiment because we have 230 staff there, or many of whom are very well educated, often with PhDs or European education. And others, of course, are much less educated, and then we have the poor villages. And all of us live within a 4 square kilometer area. We share the same water, we share the same clinic, we're all vaccinated, etc., etc. So very similar conditions in terms of many of the confounders that would generally be present in a study like this. So we thought it would be a very good way to interrogate the effects of socioeconomic status. So we divided people into 5 groups, as shown here, according to a socioeconomic score derived, as you see there, from occupation, education, income, housing conditions, and water and sanitation. And not surprisingly, there was a relationship. Those on the right-hand side, the poorer people, tend to be more stunted or have a lower height for age Z score than those on the left. But we noticed that there was a big dispersion in the left-hand group. So we thought there's more information in there, and we scratched our head to think how we could further divide it. And what soon became obvious was that some of these children were living within our research compound there, which is embedded within the rest of the village of Kenaba. And in that compound, they have very good Western-type housing, hot and cold running water, screens, air conditioning, etc., etc. And they're there because they have an essential function. So they run the generators, or they're a nurse that needs to be on call or whatever. So they're not necessarily the best, the highest socioeconomic status group. And so we said we'll divide it according to the best of our staff, the most senior staff who live in the compound or have to rent accommodation in the village. And when we did that, we saw something quite remarkable, which was that those, the very left there, are those that live within our compound in Western conditions. And the second group are just as educated and just as wealthy, have complete food security from a good annual salary from ourselves. But because they're renting accommodation in the village, you see, you could almost throw your hat, as we say, over all of those data. And they are still doing, their kids are still doing very poorly. So the message that I draw from that is that the socioeconomic and/or environmental barriers that families must break through in order to overcome stunting and anemia appear to be very, very high. And so again, Jean will talk about the thinking now in terms of what I've called WASH++, but what Jean and others are calling transformative WASH. And lying beneath this is the following, that we've supplied water to all the villagers, to standpipes around the village. There's 38 or so standpipes, so water is easily available. It's very high quality water continuously available. But that's not the issue. The issue is that water usage is very much lower. Even if you have to go just from where I'm standing here to just outside this room to get your water, you will use, on average, 20 liters per person per day. But if you have a tap and a sink and a shower and a bath in your house, then you use 60 liters per person per day. And there's a profound difference in the way and the ability for you to keep your child clean. Of course, there are other elements of this, not just water quantity and quality. So we're moving in that direction, and the top right there is the Sustainable Development Goal in terms of safe water and sanitation for all. We'll get there. And in the meantime, what I want to leave you with is a counsel for patients. And I was actually on the podium giving a talk about how poor our nutritional interventions were, when it really struck me that we're shooting for the wrong target. So we tend to assess that red arrow you saw before, the small red arrow, in relation to an expectation that we could straight away move from the situation we are now to the perfection of the WHO median. Of course, that's not likely to be true. What's more likely to be true, and you'll be hearing about this from Matt in his talk, is that we may have to wait a number of generations before we can overcome those effects and get up to a population that is growing as we would hope they would do. Here's data from Kennebar, where we've had a large number of interventions. The children are extraordinarily well looked after for a rural African village, and yet we're making progress in terms of stunting, but we've still only got halfway there in a 40-year time frame. So, ladies and gentlemen, I leave you with the thought that food and love cannot succeed in isolation. Education, of course, is absolutely vital, and education around germ theory, not just classical education, but education about how to look after children, what are the causes of infections and how those affect a child are essential, but they're not enough. All of these must build on a platform of vastly improved living conditions. And with that, I thank you, and I think we have, yes, we certainly have some moments for questions if there are any. Mr. Yes, Co-Chair, would you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, I'm Dr. Sridhar Ganpati. I'm from India. And it was a wonderful presentation. I think you highlighted on just two aspects. One, everything is multifactorial. It's an interplay of many things. So when we are being educated about a particular thing causing something, there are many more things in front, behind, and by the side of it. That's one. And second, we are now into an era where we require a lot of cohesive synergy. So if you have cohesive synergy with like-minded things in your system, you do much better. So I think the bottom line was you eat clean and play dirty.
Yeah. You've said it so much better than I did.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, Dr. Andrew. So, one thing I saw regarding the allergy in your chart. So there is some discordance between the chronic inflammatory conditions due to infections and the allergy. It is very nicely described by the hygiene hypothesis. Those community which have got large amount of subclinical infections, GI infections, they have got lesser chance of autoimmune disease and allergic like asthma, IBD, compared to the Western Europe and North America, where the hygienic conditions are very good. So it is surprising that the African children have got allergic disease. That part I want to know. The thing is the CMV infection. Now, if the community has got much more exposure to CMV, so mothers have got also CMV antibody positive. So if the 90% or more of the antenatal mother is CMV positive, chances of the CMV in baby is less. And those who are born, they have got also subclinical infections, majority of them. Rarely, if you get it only by chorioretinitis, you can find them also.
Can I take those first two questions? Let me take those first, because my memory won't keep three in my mind. I'm always very careful not to say there are three things, because by the time I get to the third one, I've always forgotten it. So the first one is about allergy. Well, as you know, not everyone subscribes to the hygiene hypothesis. I'm very enthusiastic about it. I do believe that it must be important. But you asked about allergy. So we do get asthmas, and of course there are allergic responses, but they tend to be somewhat suppressed in this population. And I'm actually working with a colleague who has been, using the phrase asthma, I think, too much for my liking, and I prefer to call it reactive airways disease. So that would be one thing to. But yes, I would. But it's a wonderful description of evolution at play, isn't it? Evolution is all about choosing the best options and making compromises between everything. And indeed, this issue around children becoming so iron deficient, why is there so little iron in breast milk? We heard from Lindsay Allen that that's the most, the standout nutrient in terms of the very low levels of iron in breast milk. Children become rapidly iron deficient during infancy. That's probably an evolved protection to help them to survive infections. The question now is we've moved on from the time when children are going to die in their thousands from those early infections. So evolution has become redundant, and can we now shoot for a different target where increasing their iron status might have a better cognitive outcome, for instance? So that's one issue. So yes, I subscribe to the hygiene hypothesis, but as you know, not everybody does. Now you see, I've already forgotten your second one.
CMV.
CMV. So, now, yes, so the child, if the mother is carrying antibodies, then as we all know, the child will inherit many of those antibodies. Nonetheless, they don't last very long, and what we see is an early acquisition of CMV in Gambian children, and that CMV infection, as you suggested just now, has consequences in terms of and my colleague Alan Sanadabo did his PhD on this, in terms of affecting the responses to, for instance, he used influenza vaccine as his probing vaccine, but certainly the CMV infection has a readout in terms of your response to vaccines. And of course, as you know, people are working towards CMV vaccines now. Your third question.
So regarding the aflatoxins, did you come across any effect on the liver like hepatocellular carcinoma?
Yes, well, so hepatocellular carcinoma is the major cancer in men in the Gambia, and indeed I had a precious friend and colleague die from that condition. So, and that is deemed to be a combination between early hepatitis B vaccine and aflatoxin exposure, and that is the lifelong sequelae, as you also know. Gambia, in fact, was the first to introduce hepatitis B vaccine. It was done in a step wedge trial, and we're still following that up in terms of the cases that are consequent upon that early vaccine. That's now 35 years later, we're measuring those readouts. So it would be expected that the hepatitis B vaccine will have reduced hepatocellular carcinoma very considerably. We hope so. Any other questions? Let's, excuse me, sir. Let's see if anyone else has questions, because you've had three so far.
The gentleman
we'll come back to you if we have time.
Yeah, the gentleman in the last row. Yeah, please introduce yourself before you ask your question.
Sridhar, I'm Shomitra, good friend of yours. Hi.
Hello.
Blinded by the light, yeah, Somitra.
Yeah, that was a fascinating talk, and thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. A couple of small things. In one of your slides, you reflected very brilliantly that the hemoglobin levels subsequent to sort of possible reduction of inflammation becomes better as a person grows up. It reduces from 70% down to about 30% in adulthood. We get a lot of sort of adolescent and sort of adult inflammation quite a lot. Do you think the single thing which might be sort of relevant here is that people get to sort of control their ways of controlling the inflammation, maybe the modulation of the hepcidin levels accordingly? Is that a factor? Like, what I'm trying to say is that, is it because of the fact that the hepcidin levels move up and down like a yo-yo in children much more than adults? Is that maybe one of the things?
So thank you for that detailed question. Several possible answers. So first of all, what was surprising to us about the data I showed you was that you're quite right that hepcidin has a relatively labile response to iron status, to inflammation. You can see relatively rapid changes, and in children it has a very short half-life in the body. So that made us very surprised to see that these levels were actually so stable over a long time. So that was surprise number one. Of course, you're right that hepcidin is intensely involved in many of the processes of infections, of cancer chemotherapy, of the high-grade inflammations, of renal damage. And you may be aware that the big pharma are supposedly investing more in hepcidin analogs or antagonists than in any other therapeutic area at the moment. There are huge possibilities, and Santrain will be able to give you more detail later if you want. But in terms, for instance, about treating beta thalassemia and so forth, there's a great deal of interest in this as a therapeutic tool.
Yes. Yes, Dr. Ravi.
Given the slides that you showed where there is more of a problem of hygiene than anything else, how do you explain that respiratory infection was causing more problems than gastrointestinal?
Yeah, well, that was the surprise, and as yet, we have a grant to try and work that through. As yet, I don't have the answer to you. I think the important thing is that it's opened up our eyes to the fact that we should be measuring this. So we have a Medical Research Council grant led now by my colleague Carla Sarami, which is trying to deep dive into this further. So the first question we'll ask is this really true? Because this is data from one study that has suggested that respiratory infections are really important. So is it really true? She's going to be measuring very much more carefully children with both clinical and subclinical infections, measuring the effect of those on iron, looking at skin infections, the respiratory tract infections, and of course the gut. So we're doing a deep dive into this now to try and sort that out. It is surprising, and that's in a way why I love it, because it is a big surprise.
Yes.
Hello, good morning. It's a very good presentation and an eye-opener. As you suggest that even if the child is deficit in iron and we introduce it in the food, the decider is the gut. So the gut, I think it gives precedence to inflammation and infection. then correcting its imbalances. But is gut always active? Because if it is not taking care of infections, then is it inflammations? Are we pushing the community from infections to inflammations? Because like in our country, as we do not have snow here, so the cycle of the infections continue to go. And there is no cyclical way you can stop it. There is change in the bacteria, the viruses. We are going through a stage when our children are having both. They're getting infections, they're getting allergies.
Yep. Very interesting that you raised that.
So the gut is either dealing with the infections or dealing with self-created inflammation due to not able to identify the food products. And even we get a long, children coming up with a variety of atopy, starting from itching in the skin, the itching of eyes, with wheezing or rhinitis, along with enteropathy. They have gastritis, and the enamel of their teeth are destroyed. There are inflammation in the lower gut. So we simply do not know that whether in correcting the micronutrients, we are protecting the child, we are pushing them towards allergies, or we are leaving them to face the infections. So.
Yeah, thank you for your detailed question. And you've described there one extreme of a syndrome that is really very, very common at a lesser extreme. So all sorts of answers. I'm going to keep this one relatively short because we have 5 minutes left in this question time. But so the first thing is the question, why doesn't this resolve? Why doesn't the inflammation resolve? And we've been scratching our heads and trying to investigate that. I'm talking about the inflammation of the enteric mucosa. Why does it persist so much? And we've been trying various nutritional interventions. Of course, vitamin A would be one possibility. We've tried N3-PUFA fatty acids. We've tried to introduce them very early before the gut damage really starts, but none of those have worked. We've tried glutamine, a number of different trials, but all of those as nutritional interventions have been unsuccessful. So that remains a real question mark. And incidentally, just as one indicator of that, if you take a biopsy of the duodenum, you know, some 20 centimeters or 30 centimeters away from the stomach, you still have very strong histopathological reaction to H. pylori, CAG antibodies, for instance. So we know that H. pylori infection is having a permanent, or not permanent, but a sustained effect. So question number one is, why isn't it resolving? And that's really part of what you raised, I think.
Another thing I would like to point out, I think it is an environmental corridor through our body. The whole GI tract is basically an environmental corridor. Because this is the tract which sensitizes our body to the environment that we live in.
Yeah,
whether the water we drink, the air we, whatever. So the changes in the environment does affect directly on the gut microbiota.
Absolutely, and we'll hear about that from Rory very shortly. But of course, the respiratory tract similarly. And you know, the combination of the, you know, the net amount of the body's immune system, which is concentrated in the gut and the respiratory tract, is huge, and the lungs. So, you know, that's really, it's our interface, the primary interface with the environment, as you rightly point out.
Dr. Andrew, this is from the desk. Yeah, I was just trying to think loud. We have enough papers on an inverse correlation between H. pylori and allergy. You acquire H. pylori in the first year, the Martin Blazer commentary and further studies. The one is from Ethiopia, a new study, wherein you acquire the H. pylori, which is an indicator of sanitation. Yep. You pick it up in the first year, the CAG negative ones. The incidence of atopy and asthma is much less in these kids than the others, because when you put up that first photograph, I was a bit tickled. I thought I should bring out this issue.
Yeah. Yes. So again, and now, you know, interestingly, so we've tried previously to do an H. pylori elimination trial, and our ethics committee wouldn't allow us to do it for a reason that you've hinted at, which is that, well, you know, there are swings and roundabouts. The infection possibly doing these children some favors in other directions, and you're probably familiar with the relationship between early infection and later gastric cancer. So yeah, swings and roundabouts. We come back to this whole issue of how evolution is always trying to make a compromise decision between all the different stresses and strains upon it.
One final question. Anybody? Final question? Yeah. Make it short and
Sir,
sweet.
You have talked about EB virus and heterophil antibody positivity in many cases. So what is the incidence of lymphoma there? Have you checked?
Yeah, it's actually low in Gambia, which would be counter to some other East African countries, for instance, but it's low. But nonetheless, there's plenty of EB virus. That would be another question. We simply don't know why that is the case. Yeah.
And how do you test the H. pylori there? By endoscopy or stool antigen or 13C carbon breath test?
So we do all of the above, but in general the answer is that unless we're doing a research trial, we don't test it. We work on the assumption that every kid has H. pylori infection by the time they're 1 year of age, and we don't treat it, as I've just mentioned.
Exactly. In pediatrics, we don't have that policy of test and treat, and the gastritis that we get is nodular hyperplasia.
But how do you know that H. pylori is there without testing?
Because we've done research studies in which we've tested every child, and we've tested them monthly, and we've been able, for instance, we published this in The Lancet in 2007, to show that children in their first year of life, they become infected, some of them resolve it, then they become reinfected, but by the time they're 1 year of age, if I recall rightly, 85% of them were infected, and all of them had been infected.
Now, what is the mode of detection?
The mode of detection in that study was C13, breath test. Yeah.
Did you come across toxoplasmosis also?
Yes, we haven't done any research on toxoplasmosis, but certainly it's present. So this, just to end on this point, this conversation really underlines how very complex the interplay is. And coming back to nutrition, which is the subject of our conference, to remind us that nutrition doesn't stand alone. Nutrition, nourishing a child in the best possible way, has to be integrated with all these so-called nutrition-sensitive interventions we might want to incorporate, as well as nutrition-specific ones. Thank you very much.
Thank you.